So you can see the title of her presentation here is Climate Support for Species Status Assessment. So I'll turn it over to you now, Kasia.
Okay, great. And can everyone see the correct view on the PowerPoint and
Good to
hear
go.
me okay? Okay, great. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this talk today. Like Carrie mentioned, I'm the postdoctoral fellow in climate impacts with the SE CASC through ORISE. And I've been working in this position for a little over a year now. And today I'm going to give you an overview of one of the main components of my work here. And my contact info is listed there. It will be up on the final screen at the end. So I'm very happy to chat or maybe direct you to some folks who can answer questions if you have some after the presentation. But let's dive in. There we go. Okay. And I also can't begin this talk without acknowledging my collaborators and mentors here at USGS, who are also co-authors on the reports that I'm going to be referencing today. Dr. Marta Lyons is an ecologist with the Midwest CASC. She's actually the first author on the work we're going to be looking at here. I'd also like to acknowledge that the funding for this work comes in part through my ORISE position, which is administered as part of an interagency agreement between the DOE and the DOI. And while I'm not a federal employee, I'm grateful to work with so many amazing folks who are. So let's see. So today I'm going to start off with a brief introduction about why we do what we do, the federal legislation that guides this work. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more about our process and approach towards this work and how we see our contributions fitting into this larger ecology climate package. Then I'll go through two recent examples of species analysis that we have done or in the process of doing. And we'll finish off by looking at some of the broader needs in the climate ecology space and how future research can potentially meet them. So let's start off with just these climate ecology connections. So I'm sure, as many of you are aware of, climate impacts all aspects of the Earth system. Changes to fundamental aspects of the hydrologic cycle and radiative balance have downstream impacts that affect ecosystems and also the humans and animals that depend on them. So when we consider the impacts of climate change on species, we have to look at both the direct impacts and the indirect effects on upstream systems and dependencies. Climate change is obviously a crucial component of long-term species success, but in order to understand how climate science ultimately informs management decisions, I'm going to go through a little bit of the framework for species protection in the United States. So conservation interest increased in the US starting in sort of the early 1900s as populations of sort of iconic animals like bison and whooping crane and bald eagles, among others, declined to levels that put them at threat of extinction. And others like the passenger pigeon actually did reach extinction. An initial law, the Endangered Species Preservation Act of 1966, set the framework for federal protection of species. An amended act in 1969 widened the scope. The original scope was just vertebrates to include invertebrate species like mussels and crayfish. And then the current Endangered Species Act was signed into law into 1973, which then further widened that purview to include plants. And so the text of the act, unsurprising for its time, makes no explicit mention of climate, but notes within its scope any species that may become endangered in the foreseeable future. And climate is an inherent driver in many of the factors outlined in the act as contributing to endangered status. And in particular, I've highlighted here a couple, so curtailment or change in the habitat and range, increases in disease and predation, and then other natural or man-made factors affecting existence. But obviously climate could really impact all of these in certain circumstances. And the ESA is considered one of widely recognized as successful and one of the strongest conservation frameworks globally. As of today, about 99% of listed species have avoided extinction. So it is highly successful. In 2016, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, in their role as the agency that is tasked with implementing the ESA, introduced the Species Status Assessment Framework. So it's a document that, as stated here, is intended to be a focused, repeatable, and rigorous scientific assessment of the species. And it's intended to capture both the species need, the current conditions, and then projected future conditions under a range of management scenarios. So species status assessments are generally conducted prior to the sort of listing and litigation process, and it's intended to be a single source document. So it will hopefully provide all of the information that is needed for any of the ESA related decisions, from listing all the way through the eventual hopeful delisting process. And in order to facilitate that, the SSA is intended to follow the species. So to be periodically updated and incorporate new information. And like I mentioned before, the Endangered Species Act has been widely successful and has, so as of yet, been able to prevent the extinction of many species. But how much is climate actually considered in that? So in 2019, there was a study that looked at all ESA documents between the beginning of the Act in 1973 and 2018, and found that only 64% of the species had climate incorporated into those documents, had climate considerations incorporated, and just 18% actually incorporated that climate knowledge into management planning. Incorporation of these elements was also found to peak in 2017 and then decline after that. So there's a couple of reasons why that might be the case and why climate change might historically be underrepresented for a couple of reasons. And the implementation of the ESA is obviously a broad and complex issue, but several drivers for that might be the influence of changing federal administrations and associated priorities, the complicated decision of how to allocate limited funding, and the lack of specific tools, personnel capacity, or just relevant expertise in the wide range of knowledge that is needed to adequately sort of analyze and plan for the future of these species under climate change. And in our work, in the assessments that we or the reports that we are writing that are attempting to identify and produce this connection between climate and ecology, we're attempting to aid in the third one. And by producing these citable peer-reviewed reports that specifically address how climate may impact an individual species, we can hopefully supplement some of that needed capacity. And I do want to highlight, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but ultimately planning for climate in the context of a species is planning for uncertainty. So often the links between a certain climate impact and a species response might be unclear. Sometimes you might actually have competing effects where a certain climate trend might have a positive impact or on some part of the life cycle and a negative impact on others. And often even further from that, interventions might not have easily definable results. So you might have some amount of habitat conservation that might occur, but it's really difficult beforehand to actually know in a quantitative way what that intervention will have as an impact, which I'm sure many of you who work in conservation know. So providing clarity on just where those connections are between the climate and the species and where the uncertainties are is valuable. And as climate change becomes an increasing threat, management plans will need to recognize that risk and begin to actively manage for it in order to make sure that the ESA continues to be a successful piece of legislation. So I'm going to go over a little bit about how we think about incorporating climate and ecology and sort of what our process is here. So this is a figure adapted from Snover et al. In 2013, showing basically a simple view of how a climate assessment moves, beginning with the collection and the process of climate data, any downscaling, then moving on to downstream modeling of climate impacts on relevant systems, followed by trying to understand how the species will respond and what management actions ultimately need to be taken. So ultimately, you're trying to use the climate information, the best climate information that is available, to inform species response. And how we actually, the part that we actually, I would say, focus the most on is trying to identify those key links and drivers, try to identify where the gaps are, and hopefully reduce the uncertainty between those climate and ecology connections. And yeah, so often that includes identifying just where the major knowledge gaps are. So if you have a connection that you think exists, is there a data set that is appropriate for sort of quantifying that impact? Does that data set exist at all? Is it maybe out of date and needs to be updated? Is it present at the correct scale, both temporal and spatial? So highlighting all of these connections is really important, and that's a component of our work. And some examples of areas that sort of need this, that need to be addressed further and have probably come up in a lot of your work are data sets and analysis concerning drought impacts, different food availability for species, changing hydrologic flows under climate change and other conditions, stream temperature, and then general questions surrounding habitat health and availability. And in our work so far, and in the examples that I'm going to be presenting, we do take a single species approach to the work. But hopefully the process that we go through in identifying these gaps and decide and sort of highlighting where the uncertainty exists can create resources that will ultimately be useful to multiple species. And our conversations that we have with Fish and Wildlife Service and other folks working in conservation spaces are also really crucial to identifying those needs. So the climate analysis that we can perform falls into two main categories. So the first is taking a qualitative approach. So this is basically a synthesis of existing literature coupled with publicly available climate data. And this generates a unique and comprehensive look at how climate may impact a species. And in the context of our work, these qualitative assessments have a quicker turnaround time because they usually don't involve new modeling. But again, they do provide that novel connection and sort of consolidation of literature and applicable climate data. And all of the projects that I'm going to be showing today and I'm going to mention fall under this qualitative umbrella. And one benefit of taking this approach, as well as the shorter timeline, is that it's less reliant on specific species location data and other data that might be more sensitive and difficult to acquire in order to try to make those connections. The second approach is a quantitative approach. So this is a study that would involve more direct modeling of species ecology and climate impacts in order to produce projections for that species. And it would contribute novel modeling as well as still an analysis of that literature. Inherent in that is a more time-intensive process that unfortunately tends to require data that is a bit more sensitive, a bit more difficult to obtain. And there's a wide gulf, as you can imagine, in species data that is available. And just two examples here. Sometimes, as is the case with say, Blanding's turtle, you might have a species that has many observations, that has a wide range, but the exact location data is highly protected. Whereas you might have a species like certain groupings of stoneflies that have a narrow range, fewer observations, but we're able to actually work with that direct species data. Oh, yeah, sorry. So once we have a species chosen and once we have a general approach that we're going to take, the first step for us in any analysis is trying to understand where the documented physiological links are between climate-related changes and species ecology. So this is going to come up again. Stoneflies is our most recently published report, and this is an example of sort of an influence map that we make for the species that sort of tries to get at where those connections might be based on the literature that is available. And we really try to stick to those published peer review studies on the species and where that connection has actually been documented and substantiated by data and species studies. And that includes looking at both, as I mentioned previously, direct impacts. So these can be connections like rising temperatures and a species' thermal tolerance, their water requirement, especially if we're talking about plant species, or even triggers for seasonal emergence cues. So species that emerge from hibernation at a certain time based on a temperature cue, or things like that. And then we also look at indirect impacts. So we want to think about how climate might affect the habitat of the species, but also other important sort of cornerstones in that ecosystem or in that habitat. So if you have invasive species that might move in due to climate changes, higher risk for disease, the movement of predators, or the movement of prey for that particular animal. That's also an important consideration that we keep in mind when we make these influence maps. We also consider how climate will occur at different rates, and that might change based on the region and how the unique life cycle and lifespan of a species might interact with this. So if we have a species that has a very short life cycle, the ability to adapt to changing climates might be more limited. If you have a longer lived species, that might be a bit different as well. And also different species have different abilities to adapt in terms of their mobility as well. So if you have if you have a species that is more mobile, that might be able to shift ranges in reaction to changing climate conditions, they might, we have to know how to treat that when it comes to analyzing that rate of change. And we also consider how climate interacts with species across space. So determining which climate impacts will affect maybe some individuals or some populations, or multiple populations across the full range. And that adds an additional element of uncertainty, since climate projections generally vary not only in the magnitude of their projected change, but in the spatial pattern of that change. And we'll see that a little bit later when I present those case studies. And speaking of this climate variation, there are a few best practices that I want to just highlight that we grapple with when we're talking about this pretty significant uncertainty, and best practices that we follow when deciding what data to use, but also how to present it, which is a big part of what we think about. And that's my main focus on these reports, since my background, like Carrie mentioned, is in climate and hydrology. So first, as many of you know, climate models represent our current best understanding of the climate system, and they are being consistently updated as part of a sort of global collaboration of modeling centers and institutions. And the main group of recognized models are known as the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, or CMIP. You might have come across that at some point. And they comprise an ensemble of different but plausible models. And the science and best practices does sort of depend on the area you're studying and the impact you're most interested in. But at the broadest level, all the models in this group are valid representations of the climate system. And that's partially because there's really no best model. So depending on the exact place that you're looking at, the exact impact you want, the exact time period, one model might actually be better than the other, but hopefully by using an ensemble, we capture that full range of uncertainty and risk. And that's really the value of these large ensembles. So let's see. And yeah, so if you are maybe working in a system or with a species where you have a outcome that might be very low probability but very high risk, using that ensemble still allows you to plan for that as part of your suite of projections. And then paired with these models is a suite of emission scenarios. And so these are basically developed as a set of realistic trajectories based on economic development and other socioeconomic factors. And it's important to note that these different scenarios are not assigned relative probabilities, but they're all realistic trajectories for emissions. And these become really important in defining the uncertainty, especially at late century. And then finally, we think a lot about downscale data and which data products to use, because again, since we're working at ecosystem scales, oftentimes that low resolution global climate data that's produced on a 1 degree to 2 degrees scale is not going to be as useful for these smaller areas. But being cognizant of sort of the different approaches to downscaling and what might be more useful in one use case versus another is important. And I just want to highlight sort of as we've been going through this whole thing, there's this really complex ecological component and the climate component as well, and that this is really interdisciplinary work that requires scientists from different disciplines to contribute to methods and analysis in order to ensure that the level of complexity for all the pieces of analysis is equivalent and really makes a robust analysis. And ultimately, one other sort of visualization of this range and uncertainty of projections that we wanted to talk about sort of allows managers to truly understand the scope of what might be needed. So now I'm going to go into some case studies, just very briefly. So these are the 4 species that we have worked on thus far. So today I'm going to be talking about stoneflies, which was actually just published earlier. Oh, sorry, the date on that might be wrong. It was published in January of this year, and we are currently working on publications for streamside salamander. Snail kite was also published in 2021. That was the first report that was put out, and we're currently working on Blanding's turtle. So to go into stoneflies, so stoneflies are of the taxa Plecoptera, and for this report, we focused on 3 high elevation species in the Appalachian Mountains. And for this, as I showed before, we had a handful of locations for this species that were primarily concentrated on these high elevation ridges in the Appalachians. And this is the same influence diagram that I showed before. So we were able to establish some connections with things like air temperature, which then contributes to changes in stream temperature, as well as precipitation that contributes to changes in runoff and stream flow for these species, because they do have a component of their life cycle that is aquatic. So that was important in determining these climate connections. And so in order to present the full range of climate projections here, we decided that instead of taking the traditional approach of presenting ensemble means, which can take out some of that representation of uncertainty, we decided to instead present a range of the model projections. So here we show from the coolest future model out of 20 to the warmest future model out of 20 for the late century period versus a historical time period for a selection of 2 emission scenarios. That's RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. Okay, sorry, I'm just seeing in the chat, we have just a quick question I want to address. So what data sets do we use for aquatic temperature projections? Yeah, so that's unfortunately one of the gaps that we do identify. We did not have specific data for stream temperature available for this region. Hopefully, that is going to be a component of a PRMS data release coming in the future, but we sort of used the closest approximation of we essentially we weren't able to use data for that, but we were able to sort of define what those connections might be, and I'll mention that a little bit later. So let's see. Yeah, so you can see that with temperature, you have all of the models actually projecting increases in temperature, but obviously there's a wide range in the magnitude of that change, and also depending on which emission scenario. So it really is important to see this full range of risk when you're planning for potential futures. With precipitation, it gets even more important because you can actually see that depending on the model that you look at, you might actually have a projection of drying in a certain area and wetting in other models. And if you were to look at this in terms of, say, an ensemble mean or just the ensemble median, you might not actually get a full picture of the true risk of range or the true range of risk when it comes to precipitation here. And then finally, I wanted to show sort of an example of using one of these downstream impact models and sort of using the data that we have, even though it might not be the ideal data set. So here we're showing runoff change that was actually produced by the monthly water balance model, which is a USGS hydrologic model, and it is run with the same climate forcing that I was showing for both temperature and precipitation. So we have consistency in the climate forcing, and then these results here. And when possible, you know, it is beneficial to bring in data from these downstream impact models, but we have to be sure to understand and caveat where necessary based on sort of what the intended application of that model was, what it was built for, what it was run for, if we're sort of using data that was not generated by us, and also the scale that it's using. So in this case, we're actually showing runoff, which is not directly analogous to in-stream flows, which the species is actually experiencing, but it is a decent proxy, and it especially highlights here how how temperature and precipitation changes coincide to produce flow changes. So you can see that here, whereas the precipitation that I showed earlier, many of the models tend towards wetter conditions. Actually, excuse me, in the runoff, you have the opposite. So many of the models actually tend towards decreases in runoff. And so understanding how those different forcings coincide is really important, even though we might not have the stream flows for the area that we're studying in particular. And yes, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ryan, for putting that in the chat. So there is actually going to be CONUS-wide streamflow data out of PRMS, like I mentioned before, hopefully being released soon, with the stream temperature component being added later. So that's going to be a really valuable data set for this kind of work. And yeah, so like I mentioned before, in some cases we don't have sort of the data that we would need, the data that we would ideally prefer for these species, for these locations. And sometimes also that's additionally complicated by the fact that we don't have a lot of information about these species. So things like direct critical thresholds for temperature, for instance. But we can still make the connections from the literature and from just sort of knowledge of these taxa to understand what forcings might be important. So here we had that data for increased temperature. We had that data for this increased mixed precipitation and then decreased or mixed runoff. And we can kind of infer how that might affect downstream impacts like stream temperature, dissolved oxygen, maybe increasing decomposition of leaf pack and things like that. And then for our second species, it's a very sort of different situation, very interesting. So this is Blanding's turtle. And I just want to highlight that the work I'm going to show here has been through peer review, but it's not fully through sort of the process of the publication. So, you know, we just ask that's considered when we're looking at this here, and I have that marked there. But Blanding's turtle presents a unique challenge because there is much more information, but it has a very wide range, as we'll see, I'll show shortly. And sometimes connections might be based on, say, a single population or lab experiments. So we still really do have to think about sort of where those connections can be extrapolated across the range, or how much we can confidently say with certain climate data that we have. So just to give you a sense, this is, you can see even just from the influence diagram that this is a much more sort of complex system. We are again looking at things like temperature and precipitation, but bringing in things like extremes and flooding. And that's also complicated by sort of different needs, habitat needs at different parts of the year. So for Blandings, they are actually found all the way from the Great Plains in Nebraska to the East Coast. So in order to kind of get a sense of the range of climate variability, we tried to include that full domain, while also focusing in on 3 locations where either there have been documented populations that have been well studied, or where there have been, you know, observed findings, and where the habitat type is appropriate to support the species based on what we know. So we have 3 locations, one in Nebraska, one in Wisconsin, and one in Massachusetts. And as I mentioned, Blanding's turtle also has has this habitat component that adds complexity, where their habitat needs change based on the season. And anyone who has worked on wetlands before knows that understanding climate impacts on these type of landscapes is a full task on its own. So really trying to figure out what we can say in terms of how the habitat for this species is going to be affected by climate was really important for us to sort of consider and try to get right. And then both try to try to articulate how both changes might be both positive and negative in how they impact the species. So just to give you a sense of some of the challenges we have with the wide range. So this is a very similar map of precipitation change that I showed with the stoneflies, with the same sort of, driest to wettest model. But you can see that because we have such a wide distribution, that there's a lot of variation within the models for where they project wetting and drying. And if you look at a particular location, that spread of uncertainty really differs for each of these individual locations. So it's important to, again, present that reality. With Blanding's turtle, because we have this larger amount of information, it allows us to dig into the data a little bit more with a little bit more detail and go beyond some of those seasonal and annual means that we had with stoneflies. But like I mentioned, even these higher data species have difficulties. So you might have studies that are based on a single population, the lab experiments, just a scale mismatch. So, we still try to be careful with how concrete sort of the thresholds we are presenting in these cases. So this is showing a very similar view of this maximum daily temperature for those individual species locations. And if you are interested in diving more into these reports, we have many more figures, much more analysis. So all of these reports are being published as part of a one main open file report that then has individual chapters on each of these species. So that main report is listed there up at the top. And then so far we have 2 chapters published. So we have stoneflies, which is chapter B, and that's snail kite, which I did not have a chance to go over today, which is published as chapter A. So I highly recommend going and seeing sort of what the full scope of one of these reports actually looks like. And so finally, I'm coming up on time here. So I just want to end with talking a little bit about sort of what we are looking at when some of my other work to kind of expand and fill some of these uncertainties and gaps that we've identified. So ideally, we want there to be ongoing work to develop the tools and data and methods that are best suited to answer these questions on a broader scale. Let me see, sorry, oh, yes, and we will try to put the link for the reports in the chat during the Q&A as well. Thanks for that. So just an example here, if we have someone say that is interested in what the drought risk for their species is, well, when we think of that, like what does drought risk actually mean for an individual species? So that might mean, will the plants that are in that particular habitat that species uses for food or shelter have sufficient water availability? Like, will that habitat be able to thrive? Maybe if you're dealing with an aquatic species, it's actually, will streams have the level of flowing water that is required for that species at certain times of the year? And will there be periods of extreme low flow, for example? Or maybe, like as in the case with Blanding's turtle, will ponds and wetlands have sort of that needed depth for different ecological activities during different seasons? And there's a couple of sort of difficulties in making that connection. So sometimes the available products don't really address the real question that is being asked, or they don't really capture the full risk. So this is often a problem in drought, where you have indices that are developed for to capture meteorological droughts or hydrologic droughts that don't really fully capture ecological drought risk. There are available products, but they might have limitations that have to be acknowledged or even corrected. And then occasionally there are just products that don't have the correct focus and the scale or the time horizon that's needed to really be able to say something concrete about this connection. So that is sort of really related to some of the other work that I have been doing, looking at hopefully trying to address knowledge gaps in ecological drought. and hopefully bring the level of analysis closer to the level of need for these questions, which is fairly high. So the first project I just want to talk about is identifying and projecting ecological drought. So looking at if there are indicators or indices that are better tuned to capture ecological stress metrics, and maybe better equipped to capture risks to ecosystems and habitat. And that might ultimately involve, additional modeling or developing additional empirical relationships. And it's highly interdisciplinary work, so that involves aspects of hydrology, climate, plant physiology, all of that. But it's a really crucial piece of sort of what the needs of a lot of these species are, to be able to sort of highlight and identify that drought risk. The other main gap that comes up, I'm sure a lot in all of your work, is modeling of future hydrologic flows. So here I really want to highlight the work by Jacob LaFontaine and his team out of the South Atlantic Water Science Center, who have been developing projections of hydrologic flows using the USGS PRMS model, Precipitation Runoff Modeling System. And as of now, there are projections under a range of climate scenarios and land use scenarios for the southeastern United States. But as Ryan Boyles mentioned, those are the full CONUS projections of that data will be released shortly. And hopefully that will allow us to incorporate a more robust analysis of hydrologic change into some of these species reports and into the broader SSAs. And that is all I have for you today. I just wanted to put up here again the contact information for both me and my collaborators. So Dr. Marta Lyons, an ecologist at the Midwest CASC, Dr. Ryan Boyles, the Deputy Director of the Southeast CASC, and Olivia Ledee, the acting director of the Midwest CASC. And I'm sure any of them would be more than happy to answer further questions. Marta is an ecologist, so if you have questions sort of focused on that, I highly recommend you reach out to her, but I'm also happy to answer questions and field any questions that you have. And then that link to that open file report that contains the two current chapters is also listed here. Oh, and thank you. Yeah, thanks, Ryan, for adding that to the chat. Yeah, and with that, I'm happy to take any questions, go back and expand on anything, and yeah.
Great, thanks, Kasia. That's really an awful lot of great information. So I'll go ahead and open it up to folks to ask questions. It looks like the couple of things that came in through the chat you dealt with during the presentation. So thank you for that, Kasia. But if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand in your participant box, in your reactions box, I guess, and then we can call on you to ask them, or pop them in the chat and we'll read them out to Kasia. So I'll pause for a second and then I'll jump in with the question if we don't get one immediately. Okay, well, I'll kick off, Kasia. Can you, you may have mentioned this and I just missed it, but how is it that the species are prioritized for this work? Because as we know, there's an awful lot of species. And so is that just through discussions with your Fish and Wildlife Service partners? Is there some template that could be developed that would allow some of that prioritization based on?
Yeah. So we have conversations with the regional folks at the Midwest, Southeast, and Northeast. And Marta and Ryan can jump in there on the call as well if I mess this up. I'm still, learning the process for sure. But essentially, they have their lists of priority species that are going to be coming up for listing or that need some additional climate support. And then hopefully they sort of identify those species that could benefit from additional climate-focused support. And then we sort of look at, where we can be most helpful. Oftentimes that includes a consideration of sort of what data is available for the species and where we can really add value. And unfortunately, there's so many species that could really benefit from the support. And there's only so much time we have. But we'd like to do more. But yeah, that's sort of how we try to prioritize by working with those partners at Fish and Wildlife.
Okay, it looks like Lilibeth from Fish and Wildlife Service put in a prioritization link to some prioritization. So
yeah, thank you for that. And I think there's also a question there. So do we have any plain language resources explaining our projection and modeling protocols? So there are some sort of FAQs of most common sort of climate best practices, and there will hopefully be some more guidance coming out on using some of the CMIP6 projections, which is the newest generation of climate models.
Yeah, but this kind of lends to the, are there some additional resources that the CASC could make available in order to explain this project and some of the implications and the processes? So would welcome input on that.
Yeah, especially if there are sort of particular questions that are fielded a lot or sort of need maybe more concise answers. It'd be definitely useful to have that information.
Yeah, so the question has come up of where those, like the FAQs you mentioned, where those are portaled.
Yeah, I might need some help on answering that. I don't know if there's a good place where those can be accessed, or if there's a way to get that. I don't know if Ryan.
It seems like we might want to put those on our SE CASC website, so that might be good to link to.
Yeah, we can definitely get in touch and work on getting some of that information. And we're also always happy to sort of have conversations with folks who are working in this space and want to ask questions directly. That's being responsive to those kind of requests is also a priority. Let's see, I think we have a hand raised.
Okay, yeah, so Mitch, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself? And
sure, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks, Kasia. That was great. That's really interesting and really robust information provided to Fish and Wildlife Service. My question, it's maybe a comment and a question. You mentioned uncertainty and risk a number of times, and I also know that the SSA process has sort of put a firewall between the biological information or ecological information provided to the decision makers and then their sort of decision process, what they do with that information. And so they don't want, they want to receive this information and then sort of apply it to a separate process for species listings or delistings. But the trouble I see with that is that this idea of risk is not just a scientific question, right? There's a values part of that. And I worry a little bit that if we're sort of forced to focus all of our attention on providing this information that you just provided us here or demonstrated here, that we kind of take away the emphasis on how much value component is really involved in that risk assessment. And so I'm wondering, one, with your experience with the case study examples that you talked about, did you get a chance to interact with the decision makers at all about how they take these assessments and the uncertainties involved and consider their risk profiles or their risk tolerance with regards to what these possible futures could look like? I just I have this concern that they think that their decision could result entirely around the scientific, ecological, and biotic or abiotic information that's provided, and not really consider how that interacts with their values and their judgment on what the implications could be for the species. And so I guess my question is, do you feel like we could provide, in addition to the basic information that you presented here, some way to interpret that and put that into sort of a risk management or risk evaluation framework that would give them even additional ways to think about how they incorporate this information into their subsequent process?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I definitely sort of Marta and Ryan, if you have any thoughts about this. So the way it's worked for me in sort of observing the rest of the process so far, there's only been one report so far that I've really interacted with the broader SSA team, and even that is sort of still in the process of being finalized and moving on to actually being presented to recommenders. So I'm not quite sure ultimately how that will work out in the fullest final form. So far, I mean, we just really focus on trying to provide them the best science we can, and hope that the report that is provided adds sort of that critical climate component to the SSA that would have been missing otherwise, and hopefully also make sure that sort of that climate risk is well interpreted. I think that's also a big piece. So yeah, I don't know if my co-authors have other thoughts about that. I just really haven't been very involved sort of in that downstream process yet.
Yeah, and I realize that, Kasia. So that's why I was, well, and I guess we have some Fish and Wildlife folks on the call, so maybe this is a question that could go out to the broader community. How do we avoid over focusing on scientific data, and make sure that in that, because the overall goal, right, is to help with the decision, or the decisions revolving around these species. And so, yeah, how do we as a conservation and management community make sure that we understand that risk involves value judgments as well, and we want to be able to provide that kind of framework to the decision makers, even if they want to make their decisions behind a closed door.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mean, not to put them on the spot, but I noticed that there are some Fish and Wildlife folks of Gen Service, or if Sarah McRae want to chime in on that. It is complicated, and certainly the SSAs consider a lot of other factors than just climate. We're just here to help sort of improve that piece of the puzzle.
I can speak to it a little bit. If Jen wants to chime in, definitely she should. But we definitely try to separate. It's very important in the process to separate the science from the policy calls, and even the risk, separating a person's risk tolerances, like a decision maker's risk tolerances and that kind of stuff, from the science. And I know it gets a little bit blurry, especially when you're looking into the future and you're trying to think of the different scenarios and what you want to provide to help the decision maker make those calls. So it's a little bit of a tricky space. But it's very clear that we have to try to separate the science from those sort of calls. And I don't know if I'm answering correctly to the question at hand, but it's it's a tricky space to figure out exactly how much information to provide. And when you get into sort of risk tolerance and that kind of stuff, it's tricky to include that in our process. Like we don't want to include that in the SSA.
Yeah, thanks for weighing in on that, Sarah. We're coming up on the hour at our time, so maybe we'll go ahead. If you want to stop sharing, Kasia, we wanted to close by giving you some information about our upcoming seminars. The next of which is one that's organized by our Global Change Fellows, who, and these are our group of graduate students who coordinate a global change seminar series each semester. And so this is the second in their spring series, and it's around communicating risk in a changing climate. So that might be of interest to several folks on this meeting. Registration link is there, and there'll be more information posted soon. So that's on April 12th. You can see it 3:30. And then the next in our SE CASC science seminar series will be one on freshwater, at-risk freshwater mussels, and some work that the SE CASC funded on looking at some of those impacts of sea level rise and salinity changes on some populations of mussels in Atlantic coastal rivers. So we hope you'll be able to join us for those seminars. And then I wanted to also close by letting you know that by registering for today's seminar, you will be subscribed to our monthly newsletter, though based on the poll results, many of you already are. You're obviously always welcome to unsubscribe at any time, but we hope that you won't. So I guess I would say let's take the opportunity to say thank you again to Kasia for a really great presentation, and appreciate the good discussion afterwards. So feel free to be in touch after this if there are any trailing questions or suggestions for how Southeast CASC can better support getting out information about some of these projects. And again, hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, y'all.